We're going to have a performance today by Robert Stovall and Dianne Hartshorn. They'll be performing as General Palmer and his wife, Queen. So without any further ado, let's welcome General Palmer and Queen.
Thank you all for being here. It's our pleasure to be here to talk to you. We have a little bit of history to tell you. Are you ready for that? Yes, of course. Thank you. I'm going to start off, talk a little bit about myself. Most of what I'm going to talk about happened before she was born, so she doesn't know anything about this. I was born on a farm in Delaware, Kinsale Farm, September 17th, 1836. I was raised a Quaker, lived there till I was 5 years old when we moved to Philadelphia. At that time, I started educating in Philadelphia public schools and in Quaker schools here in Philadelphia. Went to school till I was, I'd say somewhere around 15 years of age. Decided school wasn't for me. It was time to go out into the world and adventure. And I had an interest in railroads, fascinated by railroads. And I got an opportunity to travel. Got an opportunity to travel to England. Got some introductions. I was able to go there and I was going to study railroading and industry. I was able to fund it by writing for a local newspaper, writing articles. But if you can imagine a young man in his teens heading off. Well, let me refer to my notes here, and I've got my little diary here. I don't remember all the things I wrote, but I've got them mostly down here. I shouldered my traps one rainy June morning and marched down to the Tuscarora, half afraid that she would be gone, half afraid of going on her. The 3 weeks of ship life spent between Delaware Bay and the Mersey are only remembered as a little period of fun and danger and novelty to be recalled in the future as an experience of things which happening every day and yet are unknown to those who stay at home. I arrived in England, made some contacts, found some work, got some introductions. I wrote his articles, as I said, to help pay for it. Learned the importance of making relationships and you didn't just walk into somebody's office back at that time. You had to have an introduction to go into somebody's office, to meet with them, to talk to them. But as you met people, you got more introductions. And over the course of time, I studied railroading. I studied industry, steel industry, the coal industry. It was a marvelous time of learning. Then I returned to the United States with a valuable list of contacts and people I knew, went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. J. Edgar Thompson was my boss. I was a general secretary and construction manager for the railroad. Worked on building the lines in Pennsylvania. Now, one of the things I had learned in England, and I was able to test this out when I returned to the United States, there's a fellow named Carnegie who had a railroad and industry, and he used wood. He liked wood as a fuel. I'd learned the use of coal in England. There was a lot of coal in Pennsylvania, so that was good. We started testing with coal in some of our engines and found out that you could run a train for about half the cost using coal as it cost to use wood. That, and you weren't cutting down trees and deforesting the land by using the coal. I worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, gained gained a lot of great experience there, and then I seem to be having trouble with my mustache. It's just driving me nuts. Sorry about that. Then this horrible event happened. Schism in the country. Now, I had supported President Lincoln because I had grown up a Quaker. And one of the things I abhorred as a Quaker was slavery. And as Lincoln was elected president, as I say, I fully supported him. And when the war started, came into conflict with one of the other things as a Quaker I learned to abhor. That was war. Yet I realized, well, let me read a letter I wrote later on to the Quakers. They had asked me, this is after the war, but I'm going to use it to explain to you the decision I made before the war. They had inquired about my participation in the war. To the subject of your letter, I have given both before and since its receipt much and earnest reflection. As a result of this reflection, I can say that while I believe war to be inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ, and therefore wrong, yet I know that it would have been wrong for me to have refrained from becoming a soldier under the circumstances as they presented themselves to this country in 1861. If it be asked how I can reconcile these competing principles, I reply that I cannot reconcile them any more than I can reconcile the opposing principles of free will and fate. Now, if you'll pardon me for a moment, I'm going to shave, because this dang thing's not staying on.
I think you're much more handsome that way.
So I joined the Army. As was the time at that time, there was no standing army. Private individuals pulled troops together and formed units. I formed the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry with many of my friends. I'd made lots of contacts over the years and pulled together this group of soldiers, and we went off to war chasing General Lee about the South, trying to capture him and end the war. We'd hoped it would be a short war, but it wasn't. One time, I ventured across into Southern territory. I was just a little old agricultural reporter trying to learn on Southern agricultural methods. At least that's what I told them. The Confederates captured me, put me in a horrible prison, Castle Thunder, I think they called it, put me in this horrible prison. And they were convinced that I was William Palmer, the Army officer from the Union Army. I told them, no, I'm W.J. Peters. I'm a writer for a farm journal, and I'm just here to learn agriculture. Fortunately, there were folks in Washington, D.C. who knew of my situation, and they continued to write articles about how I was doing things in and around the Capitol. As a result, we convinced the Confederates that I was, in fact, not a spy. Well, maybe a little dishonesty there, I'm not sure. And eventually, I was released in a prisoner trade. I returned to my unit, and we continued to fight through the end of the war. After several battles, Antietam and several others, I returned, peacetime, was awarded the newly established Congressional Medal of Honor, offered the opportunity to stay in the military. I realized that I did not want to do that. I chose to return to civilian life. Wanted to go back to railroading, wanted to go back to adventuring, wanted to travel and see the world. I was offered lots of opportunities in the East to go back to work for a railroad. I was offered prestigious positions with various railroad companies. But I decided that wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to go west. That's where the adventure was. That's where the excitement was. Well, matter of fact, let me read a letter I wrote to my uncle explaining why I wanted to go west. This was in August of 1865. Your reasons that I should stay here are just those that have influenced me to accept the treasury of the Union Pacific Railroad. And though I came here first in a not very cheerful mood, young men without money can only make a fortune by connecting themselves with capitalists. The heaviest of these reside in the East, where they can look after their own affairs. But the best place to invest capital is in the West. Eastern capitalists must therefore have representatives to attend to their interests if they wish to invest heavily in the West. Such representatives, if able and correct, must acquire great wealth and influence with their distant principals to a greater extent and more rapidly than if they lived in the East, where the capitalists could judge for themselves. So I went west. I joined as I say, the Union Pacific. I actually went with the Kansas Pacific. It was called the Eastern Branch. Kansas Pacific was building a line from St. Louis from Kansas City to Denver at that time. The Union Pacific was, of course, going across the northern route and would later become the first transcontinental. But the Kansas Pacific was going from Kansas City to Denver, and I helped supervise the construction of that line. My job was to find a route across. One of the people that helped me greatly in that was a fellow by the name of Colonel William Greenwood, military officer. He was a surveyor. He helped survey all the lines, find the routes across. Also a fellow by the name of William Bell. He was a doctor from England. He wanted to be part of this. They told him there was only one position available, photographer on the line. Okay, well, I'll go learn how to take pictures then. So he educated himself in pictures and came out, and we became great friends. As we surveyed the lines, Colonel Greenwood and I would take off, and we'd go all through the region. We'd cross over into Colorado, and we'd go up in the mountains, and we'd go south, and as far west as even in California at some point, go south towards Mexico. The one idea that Colonel Greenwood and I shared was to go across the mountains, perhaps up the Arkansas River, use that as a route to go west. But the executives of the Kansas Pacific decided no, they wanted to continue with their line to Denver. Let's just take it to Denver and we can meet up with the main line up there. And so we built it. We moved on and built the line up in that direction. But I considered myself to be a man of vision. I saw opportunity to be had through all my travels. I realized that all of the railroads at that time were going east and west. Where there was opportunity was to build a line north and south, particularly along the base of the Rocky Mountains, build a spine there, and from there to cross over into the mountains and exploit the resources on the other side. So as I was building the Kansas Pacific, I was traveling, I was talking to investors and going back and forth across country. And I'd become pretty good, actually, at making contact with people and raising money and raising capital, getting people enthused about my projects. And I can remember on one particular trip, I was running, I think I was coming back west. I got to meet this man. He'd been some sort of official in the Lincoln administration during the war. Quite an interesting fellow, and he took quite an interest in what I was doing. And we talked about the ideas. But I became distracted. He was traveling with his daughter. As she came into the car and sat down, I found myself paying less and less attention to her and more attention to him. He introduced me to his beautiful daughter, Mary Lincoln Mellon. I think her grandmother had named her Queen, I believe. And, well, that was it. I was smitten. This beautiful lady was going to be a part of my life. I knew it at that time. My future wife, Queen.
It is so lovely to visit Canyon City and to meet so many new friends. Excuse my nerves, for it's not often, I'm a very private person, so to meet many new people, one just doesn't easily share about themselves. But let me get comfortable first. These hats, they are such an absolute nuisance. There, a little bit more comfortable that we can visit much more easily. Thank you. I was born Mary Lincoln Mellon on March 26, 1850 in Prestonburg, Kentucky. My parents were William Proctor Mellon and Isabel Clark. Even to this day, it saddens me that I do not have a clear recollection of my mother, for she died of a very weak heart when I was only 4 years old. My grandmother Charlotte came to live with us. In fact, it was she who gave me the nickname of Queen. A few years after that, my mother's younger sister, Charlotte, the family loved the name Charlotte, came to live with us. Within a short amount of time, my father married Charlotte. And together they had, I was blessed with, 7 brothers and sisters. Now, even at a young age, I shared a passion for art and literature with my father. It was something that he and I could call our very own. My father was an attorney, and then in time took a position with the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. So we soon moved to Flushing, New York. I was afforded every opportunity available to a young woman at the time. I was 10 years old at the beginning of the Civil War. I remember the excitement and the bravado as the men marched off to war to squash the rebellion. They said it would only be a couple of weeks. I was 15 years old when the war ended. I witnessed firsthand the destruction of families as fathers, brothers, and sons died fighting for the cause. Not to mention the madness that occurred after the assassination of President Lincoln. My father resigned his position at the Treasury Department and decided to seek business opportunities out west. Being the eldest child, I was able to accompany him on many of those trips. The vast open spaces and the wild beauty just absolutely took my breath away. I remember as aboard a train that my father began to take an interest into what this gentleman was saying about a railroad. Didn't quite understand everything myself, but as the conversation progressed, I found myself becoming more and more intrigued, not by this gentleman's railroad, but by the gentleman himself. I too was quickly smitten by this dashing Civil War hero. I believe was it somewhere between Cincinnati and St. Louis
I think that's correct.
that we fell in love?
That would be correct.
William and I had a whirlwind courtship. I, of course, went back to New York with my father as he continued other business investigations, but he would write me letters and telegrams on a continuous basis, sharing his vision with me. Do you want me to read the first letter?
Perhaps I can talk a little bit more about that vision that we shared. I have a couple of more letters I would like to read to you. I think first, I consider myself a man of honor. I consider myself a man of integrity. But I realized in the business world that would be a challenge. I was so pleased to meet Queen and understand that she understood what I was facing. Matter of fact, I wrote to her in June of 1869. I said, "Don't hesitate, my darling, to tell me how much you love me. You cannot pain me in that way. Men in active life must have 1,000 relations with people they cannot anticipate or control. They are subjected to great variety of temptations in consequence. There is not time to sit down and definitely assume that the position you will maintain towards such a person or such persons with whom the ever-shifting drama of life may throw you into relations that cannot be escaped. Even if there were a time, changes that cannot be anticipated may render that course wrong, which otherwise would have been right. When we next meet, let us take up the subject of ambition and see if we cannot get to the truth of it. One thing I feel certain of, that amidst all the hot competition of this American business life, there is a great temptation to be just a bit unscrupulous. How can this best be met? I was so pleased to have Queen in my life to help be that guide for me, to help me find that correct course. I had a vision for the West. I had the experience, the knowledge. Matter of fact, I had a very specific vision. Let me share that with you. A little bit longer, I'm afraid, but I think this is one of those moments in life when clarity opens up the world to you. My dear Queen, this is in July of 1869. After another day and night from Pueblo, I reached here at 10 p.m. yesterday. I'm writing from Denver. For 120 days, we rode along the base, and not far from the base, and generally within full view of the Rocky Mountains. These grand old mountains, how natural they seem, and what a treat it is to always come back to them. The night ride was by moonlight, and I spread my blankets out on top of the coach in back of a sociable and very obliging driver and slept very soundly in the fresh air until awakened by the round moon looking steadily down in my face. I found the magnificent Pikes Peak towering immediately above at an elevation of over 14,000 feet, topped with perhaps a little bit of snow. I suspect some of you have seen Pikes Peak or the other mountains topped off that way. I could not sleep anymore with all the splendid panorama of the mountains gradually unrolling itself, and as the moon faded and the sun began to rise, but sleepy though I was, I sat up and drank in, along with the purest mountain air, the full exhilaration of that early morning ride. At Colorado City, the Garden of the Gods, we stopped to take breakfast. I freshened up by a preliminary bath in the fountain, whose valley we had followed all night and morning. Near here are the finest springs of soda and the most enticing scenery. I am sure there will be a famous resort here soon after a railroad reaches Denver. The scenery is even finer south of Denver than north of it. And besides, the grass is greener, there is more water, a little forest of pine. Occasionally a sight is gladdened by a ride by comfortable farmhouses, which are dotted closest continuously from the Arkansas to the Platte. If I go back the same way, I shall try to stop off at the Garden of the Gods and run up to the summit of Ute Pass to take a look over South Park. I somehow fancied that an exploration of the dancing little tributaries of the monument or the fountain might dissolve somewhere near where they were leaping with delight from the cavernous wall of the Rocky Mountains, perhaps some charming spot where we might make a future home. Queen and I continued to correspond. Many years I wanted to make clear my vision. I have another letter. It kind of sets out that vision, if you will. Let's make sure we get, yeah, there we are. I think this really sets forth the plan I had. I had the knowledge. I'd been responsible for surveying. I'd been responsible for land acquisition. I conducted fundraising for projects. I planned and supervised construction, and most important, I had the contacts I needed to make this a success. And so one night, as I was riding along, I wrote this letter from Salina, Kansas to Queen, January of 1870. I had a dream last evening while sitting in the gloaming of the car window. Shall I tell it to you, my dear? And of course she answered yes. I thought how fine it would be to have a little railroad a few hundred miles in length, all under one's control with one's friends, to have no jealousies and contests and differing policies, but to be able to carry out unimpeded and harmoniously one's views in regard to what ought to be and ought not to be done. In this ideal railroad, all of my friends should be interested. The most fitting men should be chosen for different positions, and all would be heartedly and contentedly working towards the common end. I listed a bunch of people that I wanted. I named name by name. I identified the various people that I'd known through my explorations in England, through my military years. I knew who would be where. I would have every one of these as well as every other employee on the road. And I think this was one of my great foresights, I believe. No matter how low their rank, interested in the stock and profits of the line, so that each and all should feel as if it were their own business, and that they were adding to their store and growing more prosperous, doing along with the road. They should feel as if it was their own railroad and not some stranger, small, soulless corporation. How impossible would peculation, waste, carelessness, and management be on our road? Impossible, I said. It would be quite a little family. Everybody should be looked after to see that there was no distress among the workmen and their families, and that schools should be put up for them in both houses. There should be libraries, should be lectures, and there would never be any strikes or hard feelings among the laborers toward the capitalist, for they should be capitalists themselves in a small way and be paid enough to enable them to save something, and those savings they should be furnished with opportunities of investing and along with the railroad so that they all had their interest in the same as their employers. My dream was all of a new mode of making money. Not just that, however, but a model way of conjoining that with the usefulness on a large scale, solving with it a great many vexed social problems. With that, I proceeded with my plans for the railroad, but most importantly, I received a response from Queen, which absolutely encouraged me.
You see, I grew up with my grandmother, Charlotte. Her and my grandfather were pioneers on the Minnesota frontier. So I grew up with these stories of settling out in the frontier and the sacrifices and the hardships and the excitement that they met. So you have no idea, ladies, how exciting this was for me to almost step into the footsteps of my grandmother and carry on working beside her husband to settle a frontier. I kept all of William's letters very near and dear to my heart. This was one that was a reply that I received from him. So unfortunately, as William traveled so often, many of my letters were lost. January of 1870, just a few weeks after the last letter. When I arose this morning and approached the window, a sight burst upon me, which was worthy of God's own day. The range, all covered with snow, arose pure and grand from the brown plains. As I looked, I thought, could one live in constant view of these grand mountains without being elevated by them into a lofty plane of thought and purpose? Oh, even now, it still takes my breath away. And then our future home occurred to me, and I felt so happy that would I have such a wife who was broad enough, earnest enough, wise and good and pure enough to think that a wild home amidst such scenery was preferable to a brownstone palace in a fashionable city. To go out each evening on some neighboring hill and find each time a new vision of beauty and grandeur. Oh, how we could study each new revelation until it becomes so familiar to us and so enwrapped with some little adventure or experience that whenever in the future we would catch it again, it would rush upon us like an old friend, recalling in a moment a whole flood of sacred associations. Could we ever live away from the mountains? Perhaps so, but I think I would always seem like some exile to both of us, and I could not agree more. And that home would always feel as if it was balmed in the shade of those old peaks. I feel all my former enthusiasm coming back. On reaching the mountain base, which seems, after crossing the plains, like the shore of a glorious new land, a newer and grander and happier Columbia than that greeted the great sailor on the beach of Santo Domingo. I mean, ladies, how could you not be swept off of your feet?
As time proceeded, I continued to work on my railroad, and we continued to make plans for our future together. As I say, this was January, February of 1870. Our courtship was largely conducted long distance, although I traveled to New York frequently to visit with Queen. Finished up building the Kansas Pacific Railroad and set forth to put my dream of heading north-south. Marriage was, of course, in our plans. I was still traveling to England to raise money. I was still traveling west to explore. But yet I kept coming back and communicating with Queen. And that time finally came, did it not, my dear?
Oh, most definitely. One last letter in February when he described our home. You do not know how glad I was to find that you believe in and sympathize with my dream at the car window. We will talk it over fully and have the finest sort of time when you come out, working it all up in detail. Your letter, which the one you lost, has almost determined me. I have taken indeed a sort of preliminary step. It is so confidential, yet I hardly dare to whisper it to myself. But I had the smallest first flooring in the way, or rather to the organization independent of the Kansas and Pacific Railroad. Imagine creating our own railroad. And all other parties, except my personal friends or the North or South Railroad. I have written to you to go along the base. I have written to you about the railroad, as you had mentioned, to go along the base of the Rocky Mountains and right past Bijou, but not near enough to make it noisy, only to hear enough of the cars, look graceful across the Monument Valley from our cottage. It won't hurt when it's our own little railroad, will it? As William said, after a whirlwind courtship, he came to visit many times, but mostly our courting was done by letter and telegram. William and I had a small, private, intimate wedding at my father's home in Flushing, and then we traveled to Europe for our honeymoon. We attended the theater, visited many art museums, for William and I, like my father and I, also shared a passion for art. We visited castles and could only dream of what our home would be. And even though we were on our honeymoon, William took the opportunity to seek out investors for his railroad. I found myself alone many evenings, but I understood that this was going to be part of being Mrs. William Jackson Palmer, and it was a role that I took on gladly. It also afforded myself to meet many dear and what would soon become lifelong dear friends. One of those was Rose Kingsley. Her brother Morris had been hired as a treasury for the Colorado Springs Land Company. Rose had such an adventuresome spirit, and I felt just even more encouraged being with her. After our honeymoon, we traveled back to New York, where I stayed with my family, while William went on ahead to the Fountain Colony to make the final preparations of our home.
Meantime, as I say, I was building the railroad, started in 1870, started building down from Denver. And as I said, I had envisioned this resort-like community at the base of Pikes Peak. It was to be laid out with broad avenues and tree-lined avenues. It was to be unlike that Colorado City that was across the river, which is a center of debauchery and alcohol. Of course, being raised a Quaker, I did not consume alcohol and did not believe the consumption of alcohol was appropriate. I laid out the street and built the grand avenues, and I saw the opportunities that presented themselves. At the same time, I went up and I found this wonderful little sort of glen at the base of the cliffs. And we got in there and I named it, and I saw an eagle flying overhead. And I realized that there were nests there. The eagles lived there. Therefore, I called the place Glen Erie. That's where I intended to build a house. Well, back in the area which was to become Colorado Springs, several of my friends acquired property. I mentioned Dr. Bell, who worked with me on the railroad. He joined in this. He brought some acreage. Major Henry McAllister, another companion and friend, became a lifelong friend. He bought acreage. We had Governor Hunt, Colorado Governor Hunt. He also purchased some acreage to help make this town. And we laid it out with the broad streets and the avenues. It was modeled after the town of Greeley. I don't know if you're familiar with that area. Very similar, including the prohibition of having or distilling alcohol within the city limits. That was part of the reason I brought the railroad into Colorado City, into Colorado Springs, to avoid Colorado City, to be on the other side of the river. It was also that I recognized that this was an opportunity to build communities, and it would become a pattern that I would follow later on. In 1871, we laid out the first stake, the lots were surveyed. We gave one lot to each Christian denomination within the town. There were to be lots for schools and colleges. In the meantime, I was working at building our house in Glen Eyrie. The Queen was living in New York, and this was not a pleasant condition for either one of us, and I was most anxious to get Queen out to come live with us, live with me, rather, in Colorado Springs. She was going to bring her family, her stepmother and her siblings, I should say. But I wanted to build this castle fit for a queen, but getting a little resistance from her stepmother, who was not, well, let's say she had heard some stories about the West and how wild and crazy and dangerous the West was.
But she wasn't blindly in love either.
She what?
She was not blindly in love either.
Well, that's true. She was with your father.
Well, that's true. But not you.
So I wrote to her in July of 1871. I said, "It is more dangerous to live in the proximity of a great city such as New York than it would be amongst the Indians on the plains. Your mother should congratulate herself on the prospect of soon getting her lot removed far away from such dangers. The immigration movement thus began and will be imitated by many people, doubtless, and there shall have a new and better civilization in the far West. Only may the people never get to be as thick on the east as they are on the eastern seaboard. We will surrender that." Pardon me, I can't read my own writing. "We will surrender as a part of our extensive castle garden to receive and filter the foreign swarms and prepare them by a gradual process for coming to the inner temple of Americanism out in Colorado, where the Republican institutions would be maintained. Pristine parity, isn't that a logical as well as unique notion?" I think that capped it. It made the move possible for you, did it not?
It helped, most definitely. Well, even before William sent my stepmother that letter of encouragement, he would send me almost daily telegrams asking my advice on every aspect of the building of our home, even down to the color of the shutters. At last, I received the telegram that I had so long waited for. William was at last ready for me to join him in our new home at the Fountain Colony. Of course, my father and my stepmother and my 7 step-siblings accompanied me. Now, my father, William Proctor, had become a very prominent part of General Palmer's vision, and he was very instrumental in the founding and working with self-published. So it was very natural for him to accompany us. I remember pulling into the train station, and I was looking for this mountain that William has so gloriously written about in so many letters. It was actually, I believe it was the fall, it was cold, it was rainy, it was foggy, it was just miserable. I did not see this mountain at all that he had written about. And I was beginning to fear that William may have exaggerated about the beauty of this place. Of course, being a gentleman, he may have seen things a little bit differently than a woman. But upon awakening the next day, the skies have cleared. And there I looked upon Pikes Peak. As William had mentioned in so many letters, the tip of the peak just glistening with a new layer of like almost crystal-like snow. And now I knew why he had picked this place for our home. Now, when we arrived at the train station, William wasn't there to greet me. In fact, I would not see him for another 3 weeks. Luckily, Dr. Bell, who had also become, he and his wife, Cara, had become very dear friends. So we moved into the house, and again, a gentleman's definition of what is considered proper living conditions, shall we say, leaves a lot to be desired. The house was not yet complete. In fact, we lived above the stable. We had our bedroom, our sleeping quarters, and our living quarters. Now, to separate it when we did have company, he was able to put up a canvas partition. And also on one of these trips, my dear friend Rose Kingsley came to visit. As I mentioned, her brother Morris was part of the land company as well. Rose was a wonderful writer. In fact, she wrote a book. It's a very lengthy title, I can't read the side. South by West, Adventures in the New Land. So she wrote all about our adventures. In time when we did have company, Rose actually had to go down to the Colorado Springs Hotel to borrow silverware and china to accompany our guest. Now, growing up, as I did, I was afforded every opportunity as an education for a young lady at the time, and I also knew the importance of a school for the beginning of a community. I saw so many families coming in, and there was children with no clear direction. So with William's blessing, I started the first school, and with Rose, we went about and we recruited the help of many of the women that lived in the community. One of those was Helen Hunt Jackson, a very prolific writer herself, who donated books to a reading room. And then in the evenings, for there wasn't much to do in the colony at the time, and to alleviate the boredom that I feared the residents would have, we would have musical concerts, and Morris had such a beautiful voice that oftentimes he would go on for a standing ovation.
After Queen moved out, we continued with our explorations, building the railroad, built the railroad down to Pueblo, got to Pueblo in 1872, formed the town of South Pueblo. Once again, preferring to create new communities rather than to go into existing ones. At South Pueblo, realized that this would be an ideal location to build a mill where we could make our own rails rather than import them from the east, because I had chosen to build a narrow gauge railroad. Because I knew we would be crossing the mountains, and the narrow gauge would make it much easier to climb the hills and turn the corners and get around the bends. We went to South Pueblo and we formed a steel company, started moving on south, the goal again, remember, is to go on down to southern Colorado, through New Mexico, and on into Mexico. Also built a line down there and started to go west because we would need coal for our mills. Came west along the Arkansas River to a place called LeBron. I believe that's kind of near what you call Florence now. Brought the line to LeBron to exploit the coal fields. But meantime, I continued to explore to the south because, again, the aim was to get to Mexico. And my wife, being the adventurous lady that she was, actually joined me on a trip. It was a wonderful trip. We traveled out to California, and then, well, why don't you tell them about that adventure, my dear?
And going back and reading Rose's book, she does mention the coal fields in your community. So she covered the whole area in her stories. Oh, I can remember the trip to Mexico. I was rather excited, even though Mexico was in a great deal of turmoil at the time. You have no idea how grateful I was that Rose accompanied us, for I would have been the only woman on the trip. Before we left the border of California to travel into this foreign land, the gentleman who accompanied us made sure that Rose and I were both proficient with the use of a firearm. We traveled in what was called a large wagon, but the military usually referred to them as an ambulance. So what it was, in the middle, were two seats, back to back. And then there was the seat for the driver, and then we had canvas walls that could be rolled down for whatever extent of privacy you can imagine. It was a very difficult trip. It was hot, it was dusty, but we were always in fear of being taken upon by bandits, and we were. Luckily, as they rode up to us, we saw them first, or maybe we saw each other at the same time, who knows. But I know that Rose and I thought quickly enough to hide what pistols and rifles we could under our skirts. Even though they were bandits and nefarious characters, I will give them the credit that they were gentlemen, for we were not accosted, and we were able to move on, still with weapons to protect ourselves, for they took all the weapons that General Palmer and the other gentlemen had. It would have been quite a horrible experience if we went that far completely unarmed. You have no idea how thrilled I was to see Mexico City. As I mentioned, it was very tiring, and I did not inform William of this upon our outset, because I'm sure he would have made me stay home. For I was a few months with child on this trip, and I am so thankful that Rose was with me. After our trip back to the States, we sailed up along the coast, and there I stayed with my family in New York until our first daughter, Elsie, was born.
I, of course, returned to the West. While I loved my family, I had important work to do. As I said, we built the railroad out towards LeBron, and then was being encouraged. The people of Canyon City wanted us to come in. Colonel Greenwood had some land here, which he gave us for a station, so we brought the railroad to the edge of LeBron, and quite frankly, we ran out of money. Townspeople, the county raised about $50,000, so we were able to finish the railroad into Canyon City. The same time we were going south, we went down and formed the town of El Morro. Also built over, formed La Vida, took the railroad over La Vida Pass, and that's actually one of the places where you see how great the narrow gauge worked, because passengers in this car could see passengers in this car across the gorge as we turned these corners. Went down into the San Luis Valley, formed the town of Alamosa, took the train south, went down to Antonito, Chama, and all the way down to Espanola. Took the train further west, all the way up into South Fork and Creed. Monte Vista was formed out of a watering station that we had there. But then when we went south, we reached a challenge. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe had come awake. They had decided they wanted to explore further, and so they wanted to go down and cross Raton Pass, which was in our plans. Now, little known to me, Colorado had passed a law in 1875 requiring us to file our plats in order to have a claim. We failed to do so, and that ended up costing us dearly. When we got to Raton Pass, the Santa Fe had hired a bunch of well, let's say they went into a bar and found some fellas that needed more drinking money. They handed them a bunch of shovels, took them up on the pass, and said, build me a railroad. But that time we decided not to contest them at that point because, see, in the 1870s, we'd experienced some financial difficulties. So we came back and went to Canyon City and said, let's go through the gorge. Well, the Santa Fe sent a rider out on horseback from Pueblo to try to get to the gorge before we did. Now, I suspect many of you know the story of the railroad wars. We started through the gorge, the Santa Fe started through the gorge, we had armed camps, they had armed camps, and this went on for a couple of years, mostly fighting in the courts. We spent a lot of money in the courts. We probably negotiated half a dozen different agreements with each other, which were promptly broken. And ultimately, in the end, we got an order from the Supreme Court giving the Denver and Rio Grande the right of way through the gorge. But the Santa Fe had built most of the track. You know, it even built a hanging bridge so we can go along where it was too narrow. I think that was kind of ingenious, don't you think, my dear?
Well, William, wouldn't it have made more sense just to build a bridge over the top?
Well, at the time, we didn't think of it. But we went on through. I'm going to shorten this up just a little bit. We continued to build that railroad up, went up to Leadville, went up on over Tennessee Pass. But again, I'm out here building a railroad. Well, my adventurous wife, Queen, decided to go to Leadville before I did.
William and I traveled to England quite frequently, as much as one could by steamship. And I became very good friends with Alma Stretto. Alma Stretto was a favorite model of the painter John Singer Sargent. Now, at this time, the boom town of Leadville, Colorado was making news around the world. And so, being from England, they hear about all the adventures in the Wild West. She wanted to come out and witness it for herself. So we took the train as far as we could, and then finished the rest of the trip by stagecoach. Leadville was a very boisterous town indeed, and oh, I wish you could have seen the look on her face when we stopped near, I believe it was Oral City, and I pulled out a picnic basket, and as I pulled out the food that my cook had prepared, and I also laid a pistol right next to us. I guess you can say the girl of the East had finally become a woman of the West, but unfortunately that was not to last. On our return trip home, I suffered my first heart attack. I was only 30 years old. In times, even with all the recommendations of the doctors, they suggested that I keep quiet, I keep still, I can no longer go on horseback rides in the canyon. I so enjoyed going up into Queens Canyon. I had a habit of gathering seeds and gathering rocks. I just loved it up there, but I could no longer do that. In time, I found myself a prisoner in my own home. Yes, I was surrounded by my books and my art, and my friends would come to visit, but it wasn't the same. Shortly after, I say that was the summer of 1880 when I had my heart attack, and our second daughter, Dorothy, was born about 4 months later. In fact, Dorothy was our only daughter born in Colorado. And we had hoped that after Dorothy's birth, my health and my strength would recover, and it did shortly. But unfortunately, we found that we traveled back and forth to New York and England, and then we decided to go to England for a spell to visit family and maybe to regain my health. I believe we left in February of that year, February of '71. As much as I did not want to leave our home in beautiful Pikes Peak, or even William, I knew I had no choice. If I wanted to see my girls grow into young women, I remember how devastated I was with the loss of my mother, and I did not want to put my girls through that, if at all possible. We went and actually, we sailed in February, and in November of that year, I had our third daughter, Marjorie. So Marjorie and Dorothy were very close together. William did come visit very often, not only to seek investors, but there was family there as well. After my father died, my stepmother and siblings moved to England as well. The girls and I moved into this very exquisite 16th century manor house, which they called Ida Moat. We were so very happy there. But even then, as much as I had hoped, my health did not return as I had hoped. I did come home one more time, but found the altitude was just far too taxing. It appears that I had inherited my mother's weak heart. The doctors again said, move to a lower altitude. So we moved to New York. At least I was in the same country. Lived there a couple years. In fact, we lived at the Dakota Hotel. It was lovely in the spring because you could walk out the street and visit Central Park. It was such a lovely place. But in the winter was a totally different story. For here, it was rather dry, so it wasn't so cold, but in New York, with a little bit more humidity, it is a bone-chilling cold, and I didn't find any pleasure at all of living in New York. So I made the difficult decision to move with the girls back to England.
And again, I miss them terribly. We'd had some wonderful times at Glen Eyrie. Perhaps one time, I think about the one time we had a group of Indians came and camped out. They decided to stake their place at Glen Eyrie. And that was fine. We allowed them to be there. We fed them. Finally it was getting a little expensive, so I worked with one of the chiefs, and we agreed to move. They agreed to move on, but they left behind an old lady. She was aging. She was no longer contributing. She was just left to die. We made sure that she did not starve. We took care of her. We had some wonderful times with the children. One time I brought a circus to town and invited all the kids. We had a great time there. But this was to be no more after Queen had moved to England. And also as all the railroad stuff was taking its toll. After we'd built through the gorge, I'd had to scramble for money. Finally, a fellow named Jay Gould, who was principal in the Union Pacific Railroad, bought a major share of our interest in the Denver and Rio Grande. So while we completed it on up to Leadville and on, I was losing control of my railroad. I finally resigned as the chairman and president of that line, went west and built what was called the Rio Grande Western Railroad. This railroad was serving Silverton, or Durango to Silverton. We formed the town of Durango and built west through Green River and on up to Salt Lake City. Also at the same time, I was going down into Mexico. I was now working on the Mexican National Railway. We were building that. I had a great interest in that. In fact, it was down there where my good friend Colonel Greenwood was murdered by a Mexican group of bandits. So I came back and, well, I knew Queen was not doing well. I communicated with her, and at that point, she was having to write letters back and forth between the girls because she couldn't stay in her hotel room. She didn't want them to see her, rather. She would write to them, and they'd write back to her. Then I received a telegram that Queen was in very serious condition. And I was told I should come to visit. Well, I boarded the first train to get to New York, and then I boarded the first liner to go to England, but I arrived too late. By the time I got there, Queen had left us. So I gathered the girls to return home. We came back to Glen Erie. They were now, the younger girls were, of course, in their teens, and the oldest, Elsie, was 20-something. It took them a while to readjust to living in the West. But we had some marvelous times together, riding the horses through the mountains, through the canyons. They were adapting to this life. We would go back to England to visit from time to time, but when Queen died in 1894, our life changed. I'd already sold out much of my interest in the Denver and Rio Grande and the Rio Grande Western, which had merged. I was working on the Mexican Railroad, and then trouble was coming in Mexico. And eventually I decided that the time was ripe for me to get out of railroading. I sold all of my interests in all the railroads. The girls returned. We enjoyed our time there between Queen's death in 1894 and early 1900s. We had some good times. I don't think I mentioned that we had built the Antlers Hotel in downtown Colorado Springs early on when we moved there. Well, it burned down in 1901. I came back from a trip and found the remains of the hotel all fenced up, and I said, we have to rebuild. We rebuilt the hotel, reopened it in 1903. One of the things I wanted to do is I loved the kids. I loved having fun with the kids. So I decorated one of the ballrooms to look like a circus tent. We brought the kids of town in to have a circus in the hotel as part of the grand opening. I was getting along in years, of course. I still loved riding, and one day we had some friends out visiting. I think this is 1906. I was riding a horse I was unfamiliar with. I'd given my familiar steed to a friend to ride, and as I was riding a horse I was unfamiliar with, it tripped, and it fell, or not rather, I fell, broke my neck. Couldn't move, couldn't feel a thing. They discovered that I had, in fact, broken my neck and damaged my spine. I was no longer going to be able to move, and pretty much, I think the doctors had given up on me, but I survived, persevered. They made a special bed for me. I bought a white steamer so that I could motor around town, even though I wasn't really fond of motor cars. And took one more trip to England to visit folks. But one other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to have a reunion of my 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry. So I invited them all out, invited every one of them, paid their way. But what I'd done before this, after I'd sold out all the railroad, is I had gotten one last trip in my personal car, the Nomad, and I had traveled the country and distributed checks to all of my former employees. Gave all of them checks, some in the thousands of dollars out of the $1 million profit that we had made from the sale of the railroad. But again, as I say, they had the 15th Pennsylvania come into town, paid for them to come in. The city held a parade for us. They outfitted my bed in the white steamer, and we went down the main street with this parade with all 200 or so of my members of the 15th Pennsylvania. Then I realized that the end was near. It was a cold winter day in March, snow on the ground. I asked my staff to load me up into the white steamer one more time. They did. They cleared the road, and we went out, and I wanted to go see one thing. Was my eagle still there? Yes, it was. My eagle was still in the eyrie. I returned to the house, and in March, I left to join my queen. Thank you all.